Hello, everybody. Um, Good afternoon once again, and welcome to another interesting webinar brought to you by FX Commodities Exchange. Today, we'll be talking about how we could create an enabling environment for a functional commodities ecosystem, a functional commodities exchange ecosystem in Nigeria. I'm sure a lot of you are no stranger to the concept of a commodities exchange. However, will seek to demystify the myths around what people expect of a commodities exchange, what a commodities exchange is in reality, and then what are the various structures that needs to be put in place for us to have a system that is efficient and also functional. Like I said earlier, this is the first of many series, and over the next couple of weeks, we hope to be able to put in more structure and more content that will enable us as an entity, together with our key stakeholders, be able to build a functional system that ensures that there's transparency and viability across the value chain. When you talk about commodities exchange in the Nigeria of today, a lot of people remember the old cocoa boards of the 70s and 80s that were so functional and efficient in ensuring that smallholder farmers get value for their commodities. Is a commodities exchange different from that? That's part of the questions we need to answer. In the 70s and 80s, the cocoa boards and the commodities board are government-led entities. Should that be the case today, or do we need a different approach to ensure that value is unlocked and financing is available across board? On this call today, my able colleague, the squad lead for market development, Funtola Semo, will be taking us through this very, very interesting topic. And over the next 40 to 45 minutes, she'll be telling us about the myths and realities of a commodities exchange, and then the key infrastructure that is required to ensure that we have a very, very functional one. Before I fully hand over to her, just some key rules that we have to adhere to whilst on the call. The first is everybody joining will be on auto mute, so we don't have any distraction as we engage in this topic. If you have any question, my colleagues are on the line to prompt the presenter to answer the question, as the case might be, or directly respond to you via the chat. And the third rule, which I want us to all adhere to, is let's keep the conversation going in the group chat section, right? Everything we can cover, let's put it there. Our questions, our comments, our opinions, what we think, the structure that needs to be put in place, let's raise it there. Let's have a sound discussion. Let's have an interesting conversation. At this moment, I hand you over to my colleague, Funtola Semo. Welcome on board, everybody, and have a nice and interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Akinka, for the introduction. And good evening, everyone, once again. Thank you for joining on today's webinar. And just as Akinka have said, we has the creating an enabling environment, a functional commodities exchange ecosystem. And I'm hoping at the end of this webinar today, we'll all leave the understanding of the moving parts of the functional exchange of the functional commodity exchange is, and how we can play a part in that ecosystem. So in the presentation today, I will take the presentation in three parts. And the first part will be to look at what functional commodities exchange ecosystem is. We would also be looking at what the role of an exchange is in this entire ecosystem. And lastly, we're looking at what are the other rules that we can all play to ensure that we have that ecosystem what it should. So this slide is the picture of a farmer and one of FX outreach officers during our outreach service to the communities of the farmer. I'd like to state that, we've mentioned this in a number of our webinars, that in Nigeria, majority of the farmers are smallholder farmers that has between 2 to 3 maximum hectares of farmland. And working with these farmers as an entity, our first step is to enroll them, to profile them. And in profiling them, we would create an account, create a bank account for them. And this kind of give them that financial footprint or the financial. And one of the things that is amazing is that a lot of them, they are probably the first person that has an account, a bank account in their entire generation or in their entire clan. So we need to, why I'm saying that there's a reality of there's a reality of the farmer. And for us to be able to understand what the functional commodity exchange ecosystem is, we need to align our thoughts with the reality of the farmer, because the farmer is the first point of contact in this building block of having functional commodities exchange. And if we don't have that alignment, then we might not understand what the functional commodity exchange is. So having said that, so what is the functional commodities ecosystem? And what should it look like? So this is one of our warehouse up north. And a lot of times when we hear the word commodity exchange ecosystem, a lot of times are bags of grain, exports of the commodities, storage, warehouses, moving of the commodities from one location to the other, the processing of those commodities and the rest of them. While all those things are very important, the question is this entire of functional commodity exchange ecosystem. So, having said what we think is, and then let's talk about what we wish it to be. And when we talk about the functional commodities ecosystem, what we wish it to be is a market where we can all sit down in the comfort of our homes, in the comfort of our homes, our country, and have participants actively trading, selling margin calls, and with lots of trading activities going on. And I like it that, so the balance between working with the farmers, what we think it is, working with the farmers, working with grains, doing the physical deliveries, that balance between what we think it is and what we wish it to be, which is the derivative, the features, the opportunities, brings out the beauty of the commodity exchange. And that is a number of reasons. First is that it allows for innovation of products. Second is that it gives the market a whole lot of asset class that the market can play with. So what really is the commodities ecosystem? Before I go into this, what I like to say is that what it really is, we need to take a look at what is the definition of the commodities market, and we look at how we has defined the commodities market is. They tend to define commodities market from the perspective of what we currently have in the advanced commodities market of this world. So if you're talking to a trader from, say, London Metal Exchange, from Chicago Board of Trade, for instance, they have probably never seen the physicals of commodities that they are trading, but they have traded several times over the actual use. So, but if we now take a step backward, say, this advanced commodity exchange, how did they get to where they are? What were the things that they did? We realize that the roles, there are different roles that are called in that were part of the exchange 20, 30, or 40 years ago, that today are no longer part of those exchanges and have become independent entities. And all of this speaks to how these exchanges have evolved to become what they are today, which are mainly heavy derivative side of things. So for us to look at, now bringing this back home to Nigeria and the Sahara region, is what is really the commodity exchange in the context of Nigeria the context of the African market. And to help us do this, I'll be looking at it in four blocks. So we have the pre-trade block, we have the primary market block, we have the secondary market block, and we have the post-trade block. And this structure I will be looking at this in very many ways similar to what we currently have in other exchanges, like the stock market exchange or like in the fixed income exchange. So in the you will see that we have primary markets, we have the secondary market where we actually trade and the liquidity is, and then we have the post-trade aspect where we have settlements and clearing and settlement happen. The difference between those markets and the commodities exchange as we have it in Nigeria is the pre-trade block. And I would say that the pre-trade block of this mix is not a core function of commodities exchange because of where we are as a market in Nigeria. It has become important that we add that pre-trade block to the conversation mix. So to help us look at these blocks, we'll be looking at first what makes up the elements of a commodities exchange. And under the four blocks I'm talking about, so in terms of talking about the elements, we're talking about under the pre-trade, we're talking about production. So when we talk about production, we talk about how the farmer produce and how do we standardize what the farmer is producing. What the farmer is producing is a representation on exchange. Take for instance, if the exchange lists and settles in white maize, for instance, and the farmer is producing yellow maize. In actual sense, then farmer has not produced anything that's listed on the exchange. So that we need to understand how this production happens and how this produce are graded to ensure that it is a reflection listed on the exchange. The start of the element on the exchange is the OTC forward market. And the intent of this portion of market is to ensure physical deliveries of the goods, of the commodities being traded. So if we look at the OTC market, for instance, it's a market in which the buyers and the sellers transacting and having bilateral association, and ultimately the product delivered. Whereas on the forward side, what we're saying is it's similar to the OTC market. The difference is that there's a time lag between when you enter all contracts and when you're taking delivery of those commodities. So the third element that we're looking at is the spot or futures side of the commodity market. And this is more on the opposite side of what you have on the OTC market. So on the spot side, the intent here is not to take physical delivery, but to have it cash settled. So when an investor is going into a spot or a futures market, he's not going there for the physical delivery, but he's going there so that when he's getting out of that transaction, he's going there with a cash differential, with a capital gain. The last part of the element of the exchange, which is under the post-trade that we'll be looking at, is the storage aspect of it. And this part is also very important because it allows the exchange to play its counterparty function effectively, and then it gives all the participants in the market comfort. For instance, if it's the case of a physical delivery, the buyer wants to know that the commodity that he has purchased it's in an accredited warehouse somewhere. It has an electronic warehouse receipt already issued on it. And when it's time for him to take the physical delivery, he can go to the warehouse and pick up his commodities. So those are the elements of functional commodities exchange ecosystem. Now, having looked at the elements, we'll be looking at what the role of the exchange is in all of these elements. So the thing first to be looking at the what's the role of the trade? The role of the trade is basically for quality assurance. So imagine and you're in Lagos and you've traded on FX exchange for a grade one maize, how do you, because you're not seeing what you're buying, system in place that would
Hello. Seems like we're having some technical difficulty and challenges on the part of our presenter. So we'll just we'll take it off from here, and I hope you enjoy. We are all in sync so far. So when you look at from our side, we have been able to segment the markets into the processes, the value chain into 4 key segments, and that is the basis in which my colleague Olafunto was sharing the information earlier, right? So we have the pre-trade, the primary market, the secondary market, and the post-trade part of the transaction. And with those,
Hello? So I guess I'm back up. So our market is segmented into we're analyzing the market based on 4 key aspects of the value chain, and we think these 4 parts of the value chain could not be eliminated from the activities of the commodities exchange. The first part, the pre-trade part, captures all transactions that goes on primarily in the field where the smallholder farmers operate. Then we have the primary market, secondary markets, and post-trade. Part of the things we need to understand here is that the transaction does not necessarily have to happen in this order. Some could go on concurrently, but there's always a sequence to it. For example, the pre-trade part of it could be going on concurrently with the primary market of the transaction. And the pre-trade part of the value chain could extend well further down when the market is already either in the secondary market or we are carrying out some post-trade activities on it. Now, Funto already explained the elements across each section, and we've seen the key rules that are very, very important here. And one element that strikes out and stands out very clearly is the pre-trade part of it, which speaks to the quality assurance. There's no way a commodities exchange could be functional in Nigeria as we have it today without being able to set a standard for quality measurements. And this is what we're capturing as the quality assurance part of it. What do we mean by quality measurement? What do we mean by quality assurance? A typical example would be a buyer requiring maize and a seller that wants to sell maize. Now, using the term maize or the commodity maize is quite broad, right? So it gives room for a lot of ambiguity. The buyer could be requesting for grade 1 maize, so it does minimal cleaning, it just receives it and it puts it through his mill. But the product that the farmer is bringing could actually be undergrade, which has a lot of sand, foreign materials, and other things that would affect the milling capacity of the processor. Now, the quality assurance part of it is the process at which the grade and the standard of the commodity to be traded is specified at the time of trade, and before the trade could occur, the quality is stamped on the commodity. So for example, using our example of maize and a buyer, once the buyer wants to buy maize of grade 1, anybody selling maize to the farmer must be certified that the quality of maize that is being brought to the warehouse is of grade 1. And this ensures that the buyer is assured that this is the quality he's receiving. And the other way it works is when the financing apparently actually goes through to the supplier, then the amount of financing it gets is higher. And that's a key role that is critical across all the value chain. Now, on the primary market and secondary market, this speaks more to how do we attract financing to the core production. And here we have price discovery. One of the analogy I like using is asking anybody, what's the price of maize in Nigeria, right? A lot of people, somebody could quote the price of maize in Maiduguri, Borno. Another person could quote the price of maize in Kaduna, Kano. Another person could quote the price of maize in Ibadan. If you quote those three different prices, you discover that the variance between the three of them is quite huge. And it begs you to wonder, what is the price of maize? In Nigeria, we can't have multiple prices. And that's why on our own part, we've been able to come up with a methodology, which is available on our website, that spells out how do we determine the price of a commodity. Now, price discovery now speaks to multiple players understanding this process and then being able to come and quote prices. The beauty of price discovery is when there's a buy or sell order in the market, then the market could take its position and then you find the actual price level. For example, from what we were taught in school, Basic Economics 101, right? When there's too much supply in the market, price of commodities or price of whatever is sold in the markets will go down. And when demand is high, then the price will go up, right? When you relate this to the commodities exchange, then it's a means for you to identify what is the price of the commodity, right? So if everybody is putting in if the demand for a particular commodity is high, then it invariably speaks to potential scarcity of that commodity. Now, when there's scarcity, what do people do? They stock up on the commodities. And when you're buying and stocking up, by default, the prices will go higher, right? But even if there's so much demand in the market and the prices are stable, then that means market participants believe that that is the price of that commodity. And that is one of the key functions you get for an exchange. And the structure of the market, based on the question from one of the participants, is quite interesting because you can't build a market without identifying the key stakeholders, which is the next thing we'll talk about here, the primary users of these commodities. Across the value chain as well, using this framework, we've been able to identify who the key users of the commodities are. And if you could see the screen, you'll discover that, in the pre-trade part, the key players here are producers and traders. Basically, players in the market who handle the physicals to a large extent, and we call them broadly, these are the suppliers of commodities. Producers speaks to smallholder farmers, and traders speaks to bulk buyers of the physical commodities that eventually sell and carry out logistic transactions up to where the processors are. Now, we categorize the processors here as part of the primary market, even though this is not exhaustive. And why we captured this here is because they are the ones that take into control they are the ones that consume these commodities that the producers and the traders eventually supply into the market. Now, the interesting part of it, which is key to any commodities exchange, is the secondary market. Why is the secondary market interesting? Remember, we spoke about price discovery earlier, and if you look directly on top in the row there, you'll see liquidity and hedging. These are financial market terms that may seem strange to some players in the agri sector, but looking at it, it basically means anytime I want to sell this commodity, can I sell it? That's what liquidity means. Is there a market for me to sell at any point in time? And basically, it's investors and speculators that will actually go into this market with the aim of buying low and selling high to market players. Now, aside providing liquidity, most of these investors most often come to the market to be able to hedge their commodities position. And this investor could also be a processor if you look at the value chain, right? So the processor already is planning to, he has a milling capacity of, let's say, 5,000 metric tons per month, and is worried that by the following month, the price of maize will go higher by 10%, right? He could actually take a position on the physical market today and come onto the commodities exchange to hedge his position, thereby putting a cap on the cost is likely to incur in a month's time when you will be requesting for another 5,000 metric tons of commodities to drive his mill. And this is the function that an exchange that is functional and operational would typically provide. The last kind of users that are critical to the functioning of the commodities exchange are the issuers and the exchange itself. We can't talk about this without mentioning the exchange. And issuers on one hand, are basically clients that come into the market and they put out these securities out there for people to sell. So in using an unconventional example, when most of these crowdfunding platforms came on board, you'll see them offering plots of land for sales or commodities for sale, and they want buyers to come and buy it. That is the typical role of an issuer, and that's what an issuer will do. An issuer will buy the primary commodities or have access to the smallholder farmers that are farming the land and allocates it to potential financiers to come on board. When he sells it, he has issued the securities into the market, hence the term issuer into the market. And then all these activities are carried out on the exchange. After that, we will now look at who the next key stakeholders are. We'll look at the intermediary, service providers, and then the products and services that are available there. On the intermediary, a popular concept that is gaining ground right now is what we call the agri-service providers, or we call it the ASP. And basically, what's the role of an ASP? An ASP is somebody that intermediates with the smallholder farmers and all other players in the agricultural market. So basically, we know the smallholder farmers consume inputs, seeds, CPPs, fertilizers around this time of the year, right? How do they get access to quality inputs at all times in the year? That is the role of the agri-service providers. And that's why we also classify it as part of the pre-trade market. And then across board, you'll see the haulage and shipping part, which ensures that logistics activities are well done. Even though we captured it as a function of the processors, most often than not, you see traders and other players in the value chain carry out this haulage and shipping to get it up to the processor side. On the investors and speculators part, we have the assets and fund managers, brokers, and investment banks. And then the very, very critical part of it are the collateral managers, central securities depositories, and central counterparties. And if you look at this dimensioning again, you'll see that the last two parts, which is the secondary market and the post-trade market, speaks to the financial market, which to a large extent in Nigeria, we've not been able to unlock. And the initial parts are still where we do a lot of activities, i.e. the pre-trade part and the primary markets. So looking at the data of Nigeria, just a short diversion right now, we see GDP contributing about 20% to the country's turnover, right? In Naira terms, that's about 90 trillion Naira. Now, putting that in perspective, the budget that goes into Aggregate is about 200 billion Naira, which shows that there's a huge gap between the productivity of the sector and the financing that goes to it from the government. Now, by the time you add other commercial funding, which is less than 5% of total commercial activities, that's about another, let's give it 1 trillion, right? So all in all, even if you give it more, it's about 2-3 trillion that is financed through the formal agricultural sector going to agriculture. The role of the secondary market players and the post-trade market is to create the additional financing needed to bridge the gap of agricultural financing in Nigeria. So imagine having a lot of asset managers and fund managers being able to come with a pool of funds they sit on to drive agricultural activities. So typically, most of these asset managers and fund managers are invested in fixed income products or equity. But yet we have this underfunded sector, which has so much potential and is driving the huge part of the economy highly underfunded, right? And this is part we believe that the bulk of the commodities exchange activities will be domiciled, right? So the secondary market and the post-trade are what you would typically refer to as an exchange in developed countries. And the pre-trade and the primary market activities are basic activities that goes on in the fiscal market. Now we'll see briefly some of the products and services that are available across these various buckets that we're using to classify it. Under the pre-trade, some of the products and services we have there includes the financial inclusion activities we carry out to ensure that the smallholder farmer is bankable. The input financing activities, which are typically carried out by agri-service providers. Sorry, it should come up on your screen anytime from now. Then education part of it and aggregation, which are typically activities that the agri-service providers would also carry out, and then primary grading and primary processing activities. On the haulage and shipping part, you'll see activities like the trading of physicals, storage and logistics, freight forwarding, and structured trade financing, which are all the activities that goes to ensuring that the smallholder farmers could get value immediately for its commodities. And when it gets the value for its commodities, trade can start flowing through the system. On the secondary market and post-trade activities, which we have captured as the core function of an exchange, you'll see the trading activities, brokerage wealth, and portfolio management activities going on there, with the investment advisory and monitoring activities. So basically, all activities that ensures that the integrity of the financing is in place for all players are what will go on under the secondary market there. And all these products and services are currently rendered by one or two other institutions in the country as we have it here. Now, the very, very important part, which makes a commodities exchange valuable for the exchange, are the settlement services, the collateral management, market data, and technology. Why are these very, very important? The first thing is, without timely settlement or without a structured settlement plan, players will not come into the market. Nobody will put their money in any markets wherein they don't know how or when they will be paid. So the settlement part is very, very important. The collateral management speaks directly to the quality assurance that we spoke about under the pre-trade part of the transaction, right? If you look at the pre-trade and role of it, you'll see quality assurance. The collateral manager's role is to ensure that the quality that you bring in into any warehouse or storage facility at the pre-trade part of the business maintains the same quality and the standards intact all through the time till the commodities leaves the warehouse to the final consumer, who is the processor. And this role cannot be overemphasized because this is what brings integrity into the markets. The depository part of it and clearing also ensures that the buyer and seller gets settled as the case may be. And this part speaks more to the investors and speculators as the case might be. Market data and technology cannot be overemphasized in the markets we are. There's no way we can assure the food security of a country without having a sound and solid market database on which we could make informed decisions about agricultural activities. So today, most people seeking data and information of agricultural products in Nigeria always differ to World Bank, FAO, and likes, right? Now, this is not to undermine the quality of data produced there, but most of those data are now based on estimates, based on actual surveys carried out years ago, which may not necessarily speak to the reality on ground. Also, there are some insights that are not captured by those reports that are local to Nigeria that will enable policymakers to make informed decisions across board. Now, elaborating on the players that are necessary on the commodities exchange, we see, if you look at this beautiful diagram in front of our screens right now, we'll see the commodities exchange. Now, the role of the commodities exchange is to ensure that they are the intermediary between the buyer and seller of securities required for agricultural activities in the country. We all know that without this entity, trades might not go through, or we cannot attract the required financing that is needed to drive the economy. But they cannot operate in isolator. So one of the key players that we didn't mention in the previous slide that is very, very relevant to the smooth functioning of the commodities exchange are the regulators, meaning who are the entities that ensure that the marketplace is fair and square. And these regulatory bodies come in the form of Securities and Exchange Commission, the CBN on one hand, possibly the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. All these government actors that are usually neutral parties to all transactions and also provide enabling services are who are the players required here to ensure that integrity in the system and transparency of all the activities are readily available for all players. Like we mentioned earlier, the clearing and settlement part of it is very, very critical because all players, even up to the smallholder farmers, needs assurance of payment before committing to any transaction. as I believe anybody here will not put his money into any business that is not clear on how he will get his financing back. And that's the same way smallholder farmers view the agricultural ecosystem, right? And that's one of the challenges facing most aggregators and processors. Before the farmer could transact with you, it needs to be clear that he's going to get value for his commodities. So the clearing and settlement requirements needs to be clearly spelled out, and all players should be clear on the standards for this. So if settlement is T+2, then T+2 it is, and all players will expect every other stakeholders to adhere to this. Like we mentioned earlier, the collateral managers is also very important. Grading and standardization cannot be overemphasized. And investors, who are the people that bring financing into this market, cannot be overemphasized, because these are the people that are required to bridge that financing gap that we identified earlier. Over 70 trillion naira. And it will come from the investors. There's a limit to what the government will put in place, and there's a limit to what the banks could do based on their current structure. Can we create a market where investors could seamlessly come in? That's why we have them as a very, very critical structure here. On the next slide, we'll be talking about the 4 Ps of what a commodities exchange should be. And these are, in a nutshell, the products, the purpose, the participants, and the policies, which we've spoken about in one way or the other in previous slides. The products means the products that are traded on the exchange. To a large extent, we see the commodities as a basket of investable assets. Then you now develop products on top of it, like the input financing note that FX does, up to the fixed export notes that they do to drive financing of export products in the country. Now, the key question is, what is the purpose of an exchange, right? And as we stated here, we identify it as a cross-industry purpose that reflects the intention to drive the development of the ecosystem. If we are looking at bridging that financing gap we mentioned earlier, right, there needs to be an aggressive approach in terms of putting the right structure in place, right? If you look at statistics globally, by 2030, 2035, Nigeria's population should double, which implies that as a country, we need to put in structure in place to enable us to be able to feed ourselves. And the idea is not to stop there. After you feed yourself, you should be able to feed Africa and also provide the required structure for the entire global community of consumers of agricultural produce, right? And that is the role a commodities exchange is designed to play in the market. And the participants are those that we've mentioned earlier, which are critical to it, and then the policies that drives operations in these markets. And if you look at a quick case study, because we're running out of time, I'll quickly go through the other slides. If you look at globally, or rather in Africa, 2 other commodities exchange clearly stand out, which is the JSE Johannesburg Stock Exchange and Ethiopia Commodities Exchange. Now, we mentioned this here because these 2 entities have different approaches to the commodities exchange, but to a large extent, they've both proved to be a very, very successful venture. The JSE, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, does little on the fiscal part of it, but they have a very, very sound electronic structure with little or no government intervention. Whereas the ECX has a lot of government intervention in terms of mandating commodities to be traded on the exchange. And we're now comparing these 2 entities with FX Commodities Exchange, which is a private-led commodities exchange in Nigeria. So if you look at all these matrices, Johannesburg Stock Exchange seems to be the very, very viable one, except for the amber that we have on the legal and regulatory framework, which is required, as we mentioned in the previous slide. But that does not mean that they don't have a sound legal framework, but it means that more on the fiscal part, less on the fiscal part is where the activities are focused on, and they do more on the securities part. If you look at Ethiopia Commodities Exchange, the key part that stands out is the red under commercial interest for futures markets. Now, the derivatives market is one of the key things that we see a commodities exchange being the key driver of. And we've not seen that very much available in the Ethiopian Commodities Exchange, whereas it's very robust in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And then a quick comparison with Nigeria, we see that we only have a good structure, very, very good structure across 3 parts. That means that is the large supply and demand for commodities, and then the free determination of price across some key commodities, as well as fluctuations in prices that drives the derivatives market. And then being able to combine these three futures together is what we believe will drive those points that are labeled under the amber, with the amber color. Now, as you might all be aware, I'm sure none of us are strangers to AFEX. AFEX Commodities of Exchange started in 2014, and over that period, we've been able to drive turnover close to over $40 million. We've traded over 135,000 in commodities across 6 key commodities, which is maize, soybean, paddy rice, sorghum, ginger, and cocoa. And we've been able to reach over 100,000 smallholder farmers directly. Right? Directly. That means we leverage on our warehouses of 45, our 45 warehouses covered across 15 states to ensure that we have a first-hand reach to who the smallholder farmers are. Remember when we spoke earlier, we talked about the pre-trade parts, right? Which is where you have the producers and the traders. Our network of infrastructures are designed and set up to ensure that using that network, we have direct access to smallholder farmers. We mentioned financial inclusion as one of those services that are critical at that stage, and we've put in our structure in place to ensure that as farmers are transacting with us in one form or the other, we provide an avenue for them to be financially included. We provide a structure and avenue for them to be able to trade their commodities, and we provide an avenue for them to have a ready market for all their commodities at all times. This map shows the spread of all our commodities, our warehouses globally and nationally, with the key commodities and which states we fully operate. And slide 15, which we are now, speaks to how AFEX has positioned itself in the agri value chain. And the 3 pillars we stand on are farmer engagement and profiling, access to financial and commodities markets, storage, and collateral management. All our activities are focused around this. And the end goal for us at AFEX is we need to unlock financing that will drive agricultural activities in Nigeria. Yes, when we look at the whole number, it seems like a very, very huge value that we may not be able to achieve over the next few years. But we believe that you need to be able to start now, put the appropriate structure in place, and let the market develop to where it needs to be. Access and retention is one of the key principles we believe in. Big data and analytics drives a lot of our activities. An efficient market system is what we use to deliver value to our key holders. Now, remember some slides back, we spoke about the secondary market part of the market and then the post-trade part of it. These are some of the key partners we have on the primary and secondary parts of the markets, i.e., assets and fund managers and investors that could bring in financing to drive agricultural activities in Nigeria. And being able to create value for this set of people gives you a potential to be able to scale your operations largely to drive the investment of activities in Nigeria. And as we are all aware, when you invest in agricultural activities in Nigeria, it doesn't stop there, right? When you have the foundation for farmers to be able to create value and receive a fair share of the value they create, then you're promoting technology innovation at the smallholder level. As we speak right now, Nigeria's adoption of fertilizer is one of the lowest in the world. Our adoption of mechanization is close to zero compared to other parts of the world, which shows that we are still very much manually focused, which is not so much different from the case a couple of decades back. Now, if you're able to unlock agriculture in Nigeria and provide smallholder farmers with the wealth they desire, then you start seeing innovation in place. So a smallholder farmer that typically farms less than 1 hectare in a year could now expand his farm capacity. And when it doubles his farm capacity, we expect his output to more than double because he has more efficiency and skill to drive more production. And as he grows, he has more means to be able to adopt global agricultural practices in his operations and also the use of technology to drive his activities. I think I'll be stopping right here so that we can get feedback from our audience and then we could get some questions to to drive this conversation. So at this point, if we have any questions or comments, we could either raise it here or we could put it in the comment section so that we could all have a discussion around it. Right. Okay, there's a comment from Louise here, Louise Bature. Thank you. She has two questions here. The first question she asks is, how is the market structured? And the second comment she has up here is, yes, Ethiopia model has a lot of government involvement, but they also have private sector intervention like the ACOS, a key player of production, aggregation, and exports of canning beans. So yes, to answer your first question, the four model we put out there, which is the pre-trade, the primary market, the secondary market, and the post-trade market, is what we believe is the structure for a commodities market. Now, the question that rises from there is, in what part should a commodities exchange be actively involved in? Should the commodities exchange be actively involved in the pre-trade part of it, or should they focus on providing infrastructure that will drive the primary market part of it, and also create a robust environment for the secondary market to drive, whilst ensuring that the post-trade part of it is well captured and appropriately tied. Putting this structure in place and then looking at it will now give you a perspective. In Nigeria today, if using FX commodities as an example, the exchange is involved almost across all these baskets that we've identified. Not because they want to, or not because it's a sweet spot for the exchange, but because we believe that the structure in the value chain needs to be very, very clear to all stakeholders, and we need to prove the concepts, this concept that we're exposing to be a very, very viable one to all key stakeholders. So as of today, FX has a very, very strong outreach operation, as we mentioned earlier, that currently engages over 100,000 smallholder farmers. And we also have a sound primary and secondary market platform that attracts financing from capital market players and other players in the agricultural sector. So that's how the market is currently structured. And then across board, you have the relevant regulatory bodies that oversees activities across this sector. Subsequent webinars we'll be pushing out, we'll look more across at the products on the exchange as well as the structure that drives a viable one. So we've identified the ecosystem. Now we will now zoom into the actual infrastructure required to drive it. And as your second comment rightly said, right? Yes, Ethiopia is government led, but that doesn't mean the primary markets are excluded. So when we said government intervention, what we meant by that was government had to mandate trading of key commodities in the sector to trade via the commodities exchange. So for example, that would be hypothetical in Nigeria to say all cocoa, cashew, ginger that will be exported out of Nigeria must go through a commodities exchange. That's what they have in Ethiopia. We don't have that in Nigeria. And the concern around that has always been around mandating people to come on board or providing the right incentives for them to be able to come on board. And we believe that being able to provide the right incentive is what will drive, that will give value to people to be able to come and make the engagement on the exchange a very, very sustainable one that goes forward for all key players. Another comment from Adekunle Onofowokan is, how do you go about establishing the grades and standardization of commodities? This is a very, very good question. Many of our commodities have not established standards, and it is the processors that assesses the quality through their Q&A departments. Yes, this is a very, very valid question. This is one of the issues that we said needs to be addressed at the pre-trade part of it, right? The pre-trade part of it, which is quality assurance. Now, how do you go about establishing the grades? What are grades? Grades are just agreement between two parties on this is what I expect from you and this is what you deliver. So for us at AFEX, when we started in 2014, what we did was we engaged almost all the key buyers in the market to determine their requirements. What is it they need, and what are their grades requirements? And then based on that, leveraging on our strong engagement at the farmer level, we now engage the smallholder farmers on what the grades are required, the quality that is required. And ironically, if you look at the way the grading standards currently occur, the higher the grade you bring to the warehouse, the higher value you get. So being able to stick to the grade as stipulated by the buyers through their Q&A department will invariably drive to increase value to the smallholder farmer. And with this in place, is a win-win solution for everybody. So for us at Apex, when we identified and worked with the key buyers to standardize, to come up with grades and standards, we now embedded that in our processes. And at the warehouse level, before anybody comes to the warehouse and deposits any of their commodities, we carry out grading and standardization. And then based on that, settlement is made to the smallholder farmers. Ahmed asks, what are the logistical challenges currently in the value chain? That's a very, very huge, that's a question that has been bugging almost all key players in the agricultural value chain. So one of it is the key, is key, how do you move goods from far away Bruno down to where the commodity will be consumed in Ibadan, which is your road network, right? The roads network are not very good, which increases the cost of logistics for the commodities. And as we feel from our historical data and understanding of the market, at times logistic costs could cost as much as 20-25% of the total cost of the commodities, which is a very, very huge chunk of it. And the question is, what can the government do to minimize this cost of logistics? So if you look at developed countries, nobody moves commodities via rail. It's either through the inland waterways or using rail. And the question to Nigerians and to us is there a way we can put structure in place to ensure that our rail network is very functional and we can effectively harness it for moving commodities from the up north, where majority of it are produced, to wherever they are consumed, right? And this is where this is one of the key roles the government needs to play in terms of developing the viable infrastructure. The other part would be setting up processing centers close to where some of these agricultural commodities are produced, which is what drives the production, the silo set up by the government across the geopolitical zone of the country. Lucy Stambuli says, to what level is the COMEX involved with the industry enablers, e.g. the banks, in developing the COMEX products? So for us at AFEX, our engagement with the banks is quite intense and is always ongoing. So from the time we started engaging with the bank, when we started, is when we got the insights of some of the gaps in the system. For example, a key question you ask, which is very, very critical to any bank that is lending financing, that is lending to smallholder farmers, is, are the smallholder farmers financially included? I.e., do they have a BVN? And this feedback is what made us ensure that we could partner with the Nigerian Interbank Settlement System to get BVN devices that we can use for offline verification of smallholder farmers and then financially including them in the system. And when you financially include them, then you can now unlock financing to them. So yes, we engage with them in designing products. A couple of products that we have on the exchange, which I believe will be exposed over the next couple of weeks, or you can go to our website to see. You'll see will primarily consumed by commercial banks or microfinance banks in Nigeria. We see a lot of microfinance banks playing lots of activities at the smallholder level, even though most commercial banks are still skeptical of going down there because they don't have the required infrastructure. So we focus on developing products that will enable them to bring in more of the capital. Remember earlier we mentioned that it's only 5% of the commercial credit that goes to agriculture. How can we increase that 2 times or 3 times to ensure that more financing goes to smallholder farmers? So yes, we engage with them, and some of the other products we engage with them to develop as what we call our warehouse receipt system that enables them provide financing to smallholder farmers when they bring their commodities to any of our accredited warehouses. Olukayode Oluwole, which is the last question I have here, says the future partnering between smallholder farmers and AFEX under ACGSF. Why are you not working with commercial banks? So I think that's part of the question I identified earlier. AFEX is putting a lot of structure in place to engage commercial banks in the financing of agricultural activities in the country. And we believe that over the next couple of months, we'll see more involvement from the commercial banks in Nigeria in financing agricultural activities in Nigeria. Another comment from Adekunle Onofowokon is one of the things that attracts investors is liquidity of the instruments compared with other financial instruments they can invest in. They must be sure that they can get out when they want to. This needs a lot of players to enable. This is what makes the commodities exchange in the Western world attractive. Thank you very much. And you see, that's one of the points we gave under the secondary market part of the value chain and the post-trade part of it. That shows that without liquidity, players will not come on board. And the question we need to ask ourselves in conclusion is, who are the key stakeholders that we need to engage, both as an exchange and as stakeholders of the exchange, that will bring the required liquidity into the commodities ecosystem? Should it be commercial banks? Should it be asset and fund managers? Or should it be retail investors? Over the years, we've seen the power of the retail market to drive by financing of agricultural activities. Are they the ones that will provide this liquidity to drive transactions at the exchange, or should we look elsewhere? At this junction, I want to appreciate everybody for coming on board. Thank you for joining us on this conversation, and your feedbacks are well received and we appreciate it. And we look forward to hosting you more on subsequent conversations we'll be having over the next couple of weeks. After this call, after this session, the recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. So please ensure that you check it out, you follow it, and you share with your friends. And we encourage you to also follow us on all our social media channels. We are open to dialoguing with you, so feedback, recommendations are welcome from everybody. And we appreciate your interest in engaging with AFEX in whichever way you currently engage with us. Thank you very much, and have a lovely week ahead.